Criticizing apartheid is hate speech. We're making anti-apartheidism illegal.
Vast areas of Syria were completely organized by the people themselves. And these were the creation at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, of the local councils.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. We start with the Gandhi Peace Award. This prestigious honor has been given out since 1960. The first recipient was the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Other winners over the years have been Cesar Chavez, Daniel Ellsberg, Amy Goodman, Bill McKibben, and Tom Goldtooth. This year it will be awarded to Ralph Nader and Omar Barghouti. Ralph Nader has been one of America's most effective social critics for over 50 years. His inspiration and example have galvanized a whole population of consumer advocates, citizen activists, and public interest lawyers. He's also a trenchant critic of the very bloated and very dangerous U.S. military budget. Omar Barghouti is a Palestinian, a leader of the BDS movement, a collection of Palestinian groups that call for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions to pressure the Israeli government to respect Palestinian human and national rights. He lives in Acre on the Mediterranean. For 22 years he's been in that area. His status is only permanent resident of Israel. The ceremony will be held at the SSS building at Yale in the late afternoon on Sunday, April 23rd. Please save the date. It's an opportunity to hear these men and to show defiance of the forces of hatred. It's open to all, and there's no admission. On BDS, Israel is getting ever more repressive. It recently passed a law forbidding entry to any area that Israel controls to any foreigner who calls for BDS. This includes the non-citizens of Israel, Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza. It's not written down, but it appears that the government is trying to test the waters, seeing if it can go further, punish even Israeli citizens for exercising their free speech right to call for a boycott, to punish Israeli government law-breaking. On March 13th, famed activist Jeff Halper was arrested in Israel, held for some hours because of a rumor that he was handing out BDS materials. It's not illegal even to do that, but the police talked something about incitement. He was let go and not charged, but Netanyahu was sending a message. And in the U.S., there's a bill in the Senate, SB 170, which would give federal approval to any state government that decided to punish businesses or groups that called for BDS against Israel. It's not a done deal. It can be defeated. In Connecticut, over 300 people have written to Senator Chris Murphy calling on him to reject the bill. Strangely, the U.S. labor movement is not speaking up against this legislation. Imagine if people were punished for speaking out in favor of Cesar Chavez's grape boycott back in the 70s, or any of the other labor boycotts over the years. We know that AFL-CIO Ed Trumpka is a blind supporter of the Israeli government, but doesn't he see the danger of this bill for the interests of U.S. workers? And now some satire on the issue of BDS from Apartheid Adventures.
Running scared? Apartheid Adventures. Fun-filled vacations in Israel is keeping your apartheid safe. Those 50 laws discriminating in your favor, your special laws and privileges, your soldiers in prisons to keep others under control, the whole system that says you're special if you're of the correct ethnic religious category, we will defend it from the threat of those evil villains of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. They're everywhere, all over the world. They're multiplying, and they are against you feeling special. They're against apartheid. And let's face it, if you're against apartheid, you're against Israel, because what will Israel be without apartheid? It'll disappear just like South Africa did. Those BDS villains are costing us millions of dollars already, but don't you worry. Just because more and more people everywhere are joining the movement to boycott Israel until apartheid is over and everyone has equal rights, because apartheid means ignoring the majority of people and going straight to the real bosses, governments, and corporations. Not power to the people, power to the power. We're getting governments to pass laws, whether people want them or not, to make boycotting apartheid illegal, to say that criticizing the special system of laws and privileges that discriminate in favor of one ethnic religious category is the same as criticizing that ethnic religious category. That's right, criticizing apartheid is hate speech. We're making anti-apartheidism illegal. We've passed laws in France, Canada, and the US, in Illinois, South Carolina, and other states. In fact, we're probably working on your state legislature right now. So if you're against apartheid, you're against the US government, even though the US government says settlements are illegal, but whatever. Now it's illegal to agree with the US government that settlements are illegal. Okay, we can't precisely make it illegal because of that pesky free speech thing in the Constitution, whatever, but we can make it illegal to give government funding to anyone who talks about boycotting apartheid. And in a modern democracy like Israel or the US, that's how censorship works. Withhold public funding. If they talk about boycotting apartheid, the government will boycott them, because boycotting is a great thing. If we're doing it, we've already gotten people to destroy books that we don't like. We've got whole agencies of agents surveilling you, and don't make us resort to what we call civil elimination, which means you disappear, but in a politically acceptable way. Israel is spending millions of dollars on this campaign. By the time we're done, brand Israel will be as invincible as brand Disney, and we won't have to worry about silly free speech laws. So have no fear. Apartheid will take care of you, and take care of you good. Apartheid Adventures, leaving no freedom unchallenged.
The balance of the program will be the first part of a talk on Syria given by Joseph Daher. It took place in Barnard College in New York City. Daher is a Swiss-Syrian academic and columnist for Peace News. He was on tour of major Canadian and U.S. cities.
So Joseph Daher is a member of the revolutionary left current in Syria, and he's the founder of the blog Syria Freedom Forever. He just recently published a book with Pluto Press titled Hezbollah, The Political Economy of Lebanon's Party of God, which is for sale right over there. He teaches Middle East politics at Lausanne University in Switzerland, and he is originally from the city of Aleppo. Joseph is a unique voice on Syria, but also on the left, right? Because I first came across Joseph Daher's blog, Syria Freedom Forever, in early 2012. Syria Freedom Forever, by the way, is the translation of the Syrian uprising chant, Hurriya lil-Abad, Ghasban annak ya Assad, which is Syria, we want freedom forever despite you, Assad. Whereas much of the left wrote off the Syrian uprising in the name of geopolitics, Joseph's work was unique because it focused on the popular movements from below, but also incorporated some geopolitical analysis. But as the Syrian revolution developed and devolved into a civil war, a number of contradictions emerged. The first was the question of intervention, with many people calling for intervention against Assad. The second is the increasingly apparent Islamist character of much of the Syrian opposition, particularly the armed opposition. And the third was the rise of the Kurdish movement, which was met from sectors of the mainstream Syrian opposition with a kind of chauvinism, that is characteristic of old Arab nationalist movements. As these contradictions emerged, though, mainstream opposition figures largely ignored them, saying that we needed to focus on who the real enemy was, which was Assad. While they were doing this, Joseph's work advanced what Marx would call a ruthless critique of everything existing. He, not only from leftist principles, but showed that these contradictions and these new tendencies, for intervention, supporting Islamists, anti-Kurdish chauvinism, and all these different tendencies were not only contrary to leftist principles, but were contrary to the original spirit of the Syrian uprising. And this is where much of his work has been situated, in internal critique, but also advancing the narrative of the original Syrian revolution of 2011, and charting a way forward for us to continue that spirit today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joseph Dahed.
First of all, First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, all the people that made this conference possible. Thank you for coming. Hopefully we'll have a good debate, exchange following my intervention. And thank you, Nader. I think it's a bit too much what you said, but thank you very much. And so I'll start first with a short introduction on the context of the Syrian uprising. I think it's very important to put back the Syrian revolutionary process in the regional uprisings of 2010-2011. There has been a tendency to separate the uprising in Syria from the rest of the uprising that started in Tunis, Egypt, Bahrain, Libya, Yemen, and even other countries that witnessed important protest movement, even not on the same scale. For example, Morocco, Lebanon, etc., even Gulf countries. Fortunately, the Syrian uprising has been, as Nader said, mostly analyzed from a geopolitical analysis from above, limiting the analysis by blocks of countries opposing each other. On one side, you would have Turkey, Gulf monarchies and the West opposing the so-called axis of resistance being Iran, Russia, Syria, and Hezbollah. And we can see this kind of analysis today are completely out of reality because most of these countries collaborate with each other despite some contradictions. Today you have in Astana, Kazakhstan, in the peace talks, Russia, Turkey, and Iran sitting to the same table. You had for the past few years, the conspiracy started. You had Iran and the US collaborating in various subjects for the past few years, etc. I could show how the geopolitical analysis from above cannot explain the dynamics going on in Syria. The second main sort of analysis regarding the Syrian uprising has been very much Orientalist in some perspective, or essentialist, meaning, you have a Sunni uprising against the Alawi regime, which also is very problematic, and this came from the history of Iraq, Sunni and Shia have been fighting each other for the past 500 years, so therefore you cannot really resolve the problem. It's not socio-economic political problems, it's because, people are born in the Middle East hating each other, being Sunni and Shia. Therefore, you cannot resolve the political problem or point to responsibilities. To some extent in Syria, this was also the case. But the main problem with these two kinds of analysis is that it completely ignored the main actor in these uprisings, the Syrian people in struggle for freedom and dignity, denying their agency, denying their struggle. And this was the biggest problem, I thought, throughout these past now 6 years. And it's true, I always believe that analysis from below, the struggles from below are the most important, because this is where you see the energy, this is where you see the hopes as well. And as I will show in conclusion, that in long-term revolutionary processes that we are witnessing in the region, the Middle East and North Africa, the political accumulation, the political experiences accumulated through these years will not disappear completely, despite we're witnessing very hard times, not only for Syria, which is the worst case, but for the region, generally speaking. And in the case of Syria also, there was a wrong analysis on the nature of the state. As I said, it's not an Alawi regime, very far from it. It's a patrimonial regime in which the Assad family has privatized the state in many sense. And that the examples of model of revolution that was Egypt and Tunis, that was mostly the model for the rest of analysis regarding the region, was not possible to be implemented in the case of Syria. In Egypt and Tunis, you could take out the head of the regime, Mubarak in the case of Egypt, and in Tunis, Ben Ali, while maintaining the regime in place. You can see today that the main center of power in Egypt is the military, through Sisi. And in Tunis, the police state has stayed the way it is. In Syria, you could not expect, and this is why the whole, even the movement asking for reform was problematic. You could not take out Assad and think it wouldn't crumble completely the regime. You had the Assad, Makhlouf, Shalish family controlling the main centers of power in Syria. Rami Makhlouf, the cousin of Bashar Assad, controlled directly or indirectly 60% of the wealth of Syria, of the economy of Syria. You had the head of security services and of the army being controlled by the Assad, Shalish, Makhlouf family that are completely linked to each other. So you couldn't see kind of, some people were expecting, a general would do a coup against Assad. This was simply not possible. The Assad regime was a patrimonial state that ruled through tribalism, sectarianism, clientelism to impose its power. How did the revolution began or erupted in the scene in Syria? It's important that people in Syria were looking at what was happening in Egypt, Tunis, Bahrain, Libya, and Yemen in January and February. There were actions of dissent that now we discovered throughout the years. For example, in Deir ez-Zor, some people started, individuals to organize. In Kaframbel, Raid Faris, one of the famous activists of Kaframbel, talked about the first actions of dissent that were, like night demonstrations, or in the case of Damascus University, students trying to distribute leaflets against the regime, etc. At the same time, you had famous activists, historical activists that organized demonstrations in solidarity with the uprisings in the region in front of the Lebanese embassy, in front of the Egyptian embassy, and they were crushed by the security services. Which was interesting at the same time is that the Assad regime officially was celebrating the uprisings in Egypt and Tunis. In the main official newspapers, you would say these are uprisings against US imperialism, against Camp David. Busaina Sha'bani, the advisor of Bashar Assad, used to write, in the official newspapers how the Syrian regime stand in solidarity with the people in the Middle East and North Africa, while crushing any kind of dissent within Syria. And there are many reports showing how the security services were working 24/24 to try to prevent any kind of dissent actions. Yeah. And despite this, despite the repression that is historic in this kind of, in the Syrian, the Assad regime, following the turning point was the torture of children in Daraa in mid-March. End of February, mid-March, and the massive protest movement started in Syria and spread throughout the country. And when I said the most important thing in the Syrian uprising was ignored, it was the self-organization of the Syrian people, which witnessed the highest level of self-organization throughout the uprisings of the Middle East and North Africa, as I will show. It's true that in Syria you didn't have an independent labor movement for historical reasons. The state controlled completely various institutions such as trade unions, peasants association that were used as instrument of repression and mobilization of the state. On the model, if you want, of Eastern European states under the Union, the Soviet Union. Therefore, you did not have, like Egypt or Tunis, independent labor movement or the historic trade union UGTT in Tunis playing a key role. But even this, and this is also a section of the letter that misunderstood, is not a guarantee of success. We can see that in Egypt, independent labor union stood on the side of Sisi following the coup d'etat, while only a minority opposed it. But the Syrian people in struggle started to organize through local coordination committees on the level of neighborhoods, villages, towns, provinces, etc. They organized civilian campaigns of civil campaigns of resistance. Especially in universities, students were very much active. In the 5 main universities of Syria, you had the Independent Union of Free Students that were very active with campaigns of civilian resistance, strikes, demonstrations. They used to decide collectively what kind of action they should take, etc. And this was occurring massively throughout Syria, even in region that was very much controlled by the Assad regime, like for example in Damascus center or in Aleppo center, that did not witness, because of the presence of security services, and this is the main reason, huge protests like you had in other areas of Syria. For example, in Homs, the square was completely occupied. But this was one of the biggest threats of the regime. Why? Because people could connect from various areas of Homs, from various religious sects. And this was also an attempt of the regime to prevent any kind of collaboration, cross-sectarian or cross-ethnic. And therefore, Homs had to be completely Homs Square. In mid-April, you had a huge occupation of the square. We say between a couple of dozens of thousands to 50,000 people that were crushed directly, did not want to see a Tahrir Square in Homs. And also attempts to reach Damascus center were completely crushed at the beginning of the uprising. But despite the massive repression in Syria that occurred from the first days, this is important to remind everyone, we're talking on an average of 20 people dying every day. Massive repression. People, at the end of 2011, 2012, sectors of Syria were completely liberated from the regime. So people had to manage their own society from A to Z, welcoming refugees, taking care of the education, democratic campaigns. Throughout this period, you had hundreds of popular organizations, especially youth organizations, multiplying throughout the territory. You had Harakat Nabd, which was a movement composed of leftists from the coastal area, with various, displaying, democratic, social demands. You had Syrian revolutionary youth in various areas. So I could cite hundreds of examples. Citizen journalist experiences multiplied throughout Syria. Before the uprising, you had 3 main official newspapers, which was owned by the regime or people close to the regime. In a couple of months following the beginning of the uprising, you had more than 60 journals established by citizen journalists, radio coming up, etc. So an energy from below that was amazing. But to come back to the issue of administrating, self-organizing, vast areas of Syria were completely organized by the people themselves. And these were the creation at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, of the local councils. At the height of the revolution, beginning of 2013, you had around 700 local councils throughout Syria, the liberated areas of Syria. This number fell to 300 in the summer of 2016. So I'm sorry, it's not against you, huh? And the first, I think one example is important to remind people is the case of Raqqa, that unfortunately became known for being the capital of Daesh. Before being the capital of Daesh, it was the hotel of the revolution, as we called it, because you had a high amount of people from the Jazira or northeastern areas of Syria coming to Raqqa to fly away or to the repression of the regime. So you had 800,000 people at the beginning of 2013, in March 2013, when the city was liberated of the Assad regime. And during 6 months, the city was completely managed by the civilian councils, by the people themselves, and you had kind of a battle, and I'll speak of this later, with the armed opposition forces, and especially what would become Daesh. In the beginning, Jabhat al-Nusra, and after the so-called Islamic State. In the first 3 months of the liberation of Raqqa, you had more than 50 youth organizations that were created in the city, going from agriculture, education, feminist movements. You had a concert, a rap concert in the middle of the city, demonstrations against the armed opposition groups, chanting the main slogan, one of the main slogans of the uprising: the Syrian people are one and united. We want freedom and dignity. Sunni and Shia, we are one. Arabic Kurds, we are one. Democratic campaigns against, the black flag of the jihadist forces. They would raise the Syrian revolutionary flag. So during 6 months, you had the tit and tat. And a key action occurred in the autumn of 2013. It was when the so-called Islamic State transformed the church of the city. You had 2 churches in the city into a center of torture. The youth organization came out in solidarity, not only with the Christian, but with the idea of the Syrian people are one and united, and we are against sectarianism. And they held a big cross and chanting in the city, "We are one and united." Unfortunately, at the end of 2013, the experience of Raqqa was put an end because of the Islamic State, so-called Islamic State, controlling completely the city and expelling its civilian forces. But you had other examples of city completely being governed by local councils, which for the half of them were elected directly through democratic means, democratic election. Other half were for various kind of understanding, according to the weight of families, tribal families, etc., or agreements. But you had really a popular movement from below, people self-organizing completely. And this has been the greatest threat of the Assad regime since the first days, because they could propose an alternative, inclusive, democratic message to the majority of the Syrian people. And I would say in the first 2 years, they had the hegemony on the Syrian population in its majority. And one of the examples why it wanted to be completely crushed, it was because of this message. And a symbol of this is Eastern Aleppo.
More of the talk on next week's program. Thanks for watching. I'm Stanley Heller. This has been The Struggle.